Something felt different about this loss. The Indiana Fever walked into Los Angeles hoping to turn Caitlin Clark's return into a positive moment, but instead, they walked away with a result that immediately created one of the biggest conversations around the team. A 14-point loss to the LA Sparks was already frustrating enough, but what happened after the final buzzer made the discussion even louder. Fans weren't just asking why Indiana lost, they were asking whether everyone was looking at the wrong reason behind it. Because whenever Caitlin Clark steps on the floor, every possession gets analyzed. Every shot, every turnover, every reaction becomes part of a bigger conversation. And after this game, some people quickly pointed toward the numbers. They looked at the missed shots, the limited scoring, and the final plus-minus, and tried to turn the story into one simple question. Did Clark's return actually hurt Indiana? But basketball is rarely that simple, and this game had layers that a box score alone could never explain. The real debate started when people looked beyond the final statistics and focused on how the game was managed. Clark was returning after time away, and there were clear reasons for the Fever to be careful. Managing a player coming back from an injury is not unusual, and protecting long-term health always matters. But what created confusion wasn't just the idea of limiting her minutes, it was the way those minutes were spread throughout the game that immediately caught attention. For a player like Clark, rhythm is everything. Her impact is not only about taking shots, it's about reading defenses, creating space, understanding how opponents are adjusting, and slowly taking control of the pace. Those things usually develop over multiple possessions. They happen when a player gets comfortable inside the flow of a game. So when fans watched her constantly move in and out instead of getting extended stretches, many started questioning whether she ever truly had the opportunity to find that rhythm. And that's where the conversation shifted. This was no longer just about whether Caitlin Clark played well or poorly. It became a bigger discussion about expectations, coaching choices, and how Indiana is trying to balance protecting their biggest star while also competing to win games. Some believed the cautious approach made sense because the Fever were thinking about the bigger picture. Others argued that the rotation made it nearly impossible for Clark to look like herself. But the most interesting part is what happened after the game. The reaction became divided almost instantly. Critics focused on the final numbers, supporters focused on the circumstances surrounding those numbers. And somewhere between those two sides was the bigger question that Indiana now has to answer. Was this simply a difficult return game after an injury, or did it reveal a deeper problem with how this team handles its most important moments? Because once you move past the headlines and actually look at what happened possession by possession, the story becomes much more complicated. The Indiana's problems did not begin and end with one player. There were decisions, missing pieces, defensive struggles, and moments throughout the game that completely changed how this loss should be viewed. And when you look deeper than the box score, the story changes completely. The most surprising part of Caitlin Clark's return wasn't simply that she was playing under restrictions. Most people already understood that Indiana was not going to immediately push her back into a full workload after being away. A careful approach made sense. The Fever had to think beyond one regular season game and consider the bigger picture. But the moment that turned a normal comeback story into a heated debate was not the restriction itself, it was the way that restriction actually played out once the game started. When a star player returns after missing time, there is always a difficult balance. Coaches have to protect the player physically while also putting them in a position where they can actually contribute. Those two goals are supposed to work together. But after watching Clark's minutes come in short bursts, many fans started asking whether Indiana found that balance or accidentally created a completely different challenge. Because Caitlin Clark's game is built heavily on rhythm, she is not the type of player whose influence can always be measured from one isolated possession. Her biggest strengths often appear as the game develops. She studies defensive adjustments, recognizes patterns, creates opportunities for teammates, and finds openings that may not exist early in a matchup. A missed shot in the first few minutes can turn into a scoring run later because she has had time to understand what the defense is giving her. That is why the rotation became such a major talking point. Fans watching the game noticed that Clark was entering, leaving, and then trying to restart again. Instead of settling into a natural pace, every appearance almost felt like a new beginning. For any player, especially one returning from time away, constantly trying to recreate momentum can be extremely difficult. This does not mean there was no reason behind Indiana's decision. A cautious return plan exists for a purpose. The Fever had to consider her condition, her workload, and the risk of pushing too quickly. Many people understood why there were limits. The disagreement came from the execution of those limits and whether there was another way to handle the same situation while still allowing Clark more time to adjust on the court. Some fans argued that giving her fewer but longer stretches could have helped her get comfortable without dramatically changing the overall restriction. Others believed the coaching staff was simply following a careful plan and prioritizing patience over short-term results. Both sides of the conversation showed how complicated the situation really was. But what made everything even bigger was the reaction after the final score. Once Indiana lost, Clark's individual performance became the easiest thing for critics to focus on. The shooting numbers were there. The turnovers were there. The frustration was visible. But the question became whether those numbers represented the full story or whether they were the result of a player trying to produce without ever fully settling into the game. Great players usually create their biggest moments through confidence and flow. They build connections with teammates. They adjust after seeing how opponents defend them. They find their timing, possession after possession. When those opportunities become limited, the entire evaluation becomes more complicated. And that is why this single game created such a strong reaction. It was not just about Caitlin Clark missing shots. It was about whether Indiana's approach gave their returning star the best chance to succeed while still protecting her future. The answer depends on who you ask, but one thing became clear immediately. This was not going to be remembered as a simple loss. Because once those short stretches started affecting the game flow, everyone noticed the numbers, and those numbers created an entirely new debate. On paper, this was the moment critics were waiting for. The final numbers gave everyone something to talk about. The missed shots, the turnovers, and the overall impact rating became the first things people pointed toward after Indiana walked away with another disappointing result. But sometimes basketball numbers only tell you what happened. They do not always explain why it happened. That became the center of the Caitlin Clark conversation after this game. Anyone could look at the box score and create a quick reaction. The easiest conclusion was that she simply did not perform at her usual level. But when a player is returning after time away, dealing with limited minutes, and constantly adjusting to a changing rotation, the situation becomes much more complicated than one stat line. Clark's shooting struggles were obvious. Nobody watching the game could ignore that she was not finding her normal offensive rhythm. Some shots that fans are used to seeing her make did not fall. Some possessions did not look as smooth as expected. But the bigger question was whether that was because Clark wasn't ready or because she never had enough time on the floor to truly feel comfortable. That is where the debate became divided. One side looked at the performance and believed the numbers spoke for themselves. They argued that regardless of the circumstances, production matters, especially for a player with expectations as high as Clark's. When you become the centerpiece of a franchise, every game comes with pressure, and every performance gets magnified. But another side looked at the same numbers and saw something completely different. They saw a player trying to restart her momentum over and over again. They saw someone entering a game already moving at full speed and being asked to immediately create an impact before stepping away again. For a player whose game depends so much on timing, vision, and connection with teammates, that is not an easy situation.
Turnovers became another major talking point.
Every mistake from Clark gets attention because of how closely she is followed, but turnovers also require context. Some come from forced decisions, some happen because of communication issues, some happen when players are still rebuilding chemistry and timing. After missing time, even small differences in spacing or movement can change an entire possession. And that is why evaluating this performance became so complicated. It was not about pretending Clark played a perfect game. She did not. Even her biggest supporters acknowledged there were moments where she could have been sharper. The real question was whether the reaction matched the circumstances surrounding her return. Because great players are not machines. They do not simply enter a game after being away and instantly recreate their best performances without adjustment. Basketball depends on rhythm, confidence, and repetition. A shooter needs touches. A playmaker needs possessions. A leader needs time to understand the flow of what is happening around them. The strange part about this entire situation was how quickly the conversation moved away from the bigger picture. Instead of discussing the entire team performance, the rotations, the missing pieces, and the defensive struggles, so much attention immediately landed on one player's stat line. That showed just how much attention follows Clark every single night. The reality is that Indiana's loss was bigger than one player having an inefficient game. There were multiple problems happening at the same time, and focusing only on Clark's numbers ignored everything else that shaped the outcome. A basketball game is built from hundreds of decisions and possessions, not just one name at the top of the headlines. And when you start looking beyond Caitlin Clark's box score, another major issue becomes impossible to ignore. Because while everyone was debating her return, Indiana had a much deeper roster problem that was quietly exposed. One player returning was never going to solve every problem, and this game made that reality impossible to ignore. The attention naturally followed Caitlin Clark because her comeback was the biggest storyline entering the matchup, but Indiana's issues against Los Angeles stretched far beyond one player's performance. When the full game was examined, it became clear the Fever were dealing with questions about balance, depth, and how the entire roster fits together. The biggest challenge was that Indiana was not operating with the complete version of the team people expected to see. When important pieces are unavailable or limited, everything changes. Roles become different, responsibilities increase. Players are asked to handle situations they normally might not face. And against a team ready to take advantage of every weakness, those small changes can quickly become major problems. Aaliyah Boston's absence became one of the biggest factors in the conversation. Boston is not just another player in Indiana's system. She provides a presence that impacts both sides of the floor. Her ability to create inside, control matchups, battle physically, and give the Fever another reliable option changes how opponents have to defend them. Without that element, Indiana's offensive structure naturally looked different. That created even more pressure on the players who were available. Kelsey Mitchell stepped into a major scoring role and delivered the type of offensive production Indiana desperately needed. Her ability to create shots and provide scoring kept the Fever fighting through difficult stretches. Without her performance, the final result could have looked even more concerning. But one strong individual performance cannot always cover larger team problems. Basketball is built around connection. A scorer can have a great night, but winning consistently requires multiple players contributing at the right moments. It requires defensive stops, ball movement, communication, and everyone understanding their role. Lexi Hull also provided important minutes and gave Indiana energy when they needed someone else to step forward. Her effort and production were valuable, and performances like that show why depth matters across a long season. But the problem for Indiana was that they needed more players creating that same level of impact.
As the game continued, the difference became more noticeable. Certain possessions lacked the smoothness and confidence that winning teams usually display. There were moments where Indiana created opportunities but failed to finish them. There were moments where the offense slowed down and relied too heavily on individual plays instead of consistent team execution. That is where the bigger concern appeared. The Fever have talent, but talent alone does not guarantee results. A successful team needs structure around that talent. They need every player's strengths to connect. They need rotations that create consistency, and they need the ability to survive difficult stretches when everything is not going perfectly. The expectations around Indiana have changed because the attention around this team has changed. They are no longer viewed as a group simply trying to improve. People are watching them as a team expected to compete, adjust, and find answers. With that level of attention, every weakness becomes magnified. And this matchup showed that even with Caitlin Clark back on the court, Indiana still had problems that could not be ignored. Her return brought excitement, but it did not automatically fix defensive mistakes, missing production, or the challenges created by an incomplete lineup. That is why blaming one player for the result misses the bigger picture. The Fever's struggles were connected to several areas at once. The roster situation, the rotations, and the overall execution all played a role in creating the final outcome. Because while everyone focused on the offensive questions surrounding Clark's return, the biggest warning sign for Indiana was actually happening on the other end of the floor. The biggest problem for Indiana was not just missed shots. It was not only the rotations, the offensive rhythm, or the conversations surrounding Caitlin Clark's return. The part of this game that created the most serious concern was something much harder to ignore. The Fever simply could not find enough defensive answers when they needed them most. A team can survive a difficult shooting night. Great players can have moments where shots do not fall. Offenses can go through stretches where timing is not perfect. But defense is usually the area where teams can stay competitive even when everything else becomes challenging. Against Los Angeles, that stability was missing. The Sparks were able to create confidence early, and once a team starts feeling comfortable offensively, the entire game changes. Shots become easier, players become more aggressive, the pace starts moving in their favor. Instead of forcing Los Angeles into uncomfortable situations, Indiana spent too much of the game reacting to what was already happening. That became one of the biggest differences between the two teams. Los Angeles was not just relying on one player to carry everything. Multiple players found opportunities, created pressure, and forced Indiana to constantly adjust. Every time the Fever needed a defensive stop to change momentum, the Sparks seemed to find another answer. Those moments are what separate teams trying to reach another level. It is not always about highlight plays or one superstar taking over. Sometimes games are decided by communication, positioning, effort, and making the small adjustments before a problem grows bigger. Against the Sparks, too many small problems started adding up. Indiana's defensive struggles also impacted the offense. When a team cannot consistently get stops, it becomes harder to control the pace. Every offensive possession starts carrying extra pressure because players feel like they have to answer immediately. Instead of playing freely, teams can start forcing plays, rushing decisions, and chasing the game. That is why looking only at Caitlin Clark's offensive numbers did not capture everything happening. Even if she had produced more, Indiana still had to deal with the larger issue of preventing Los Angeles from finding a rhythm. A single player returning does not automatically repair defensive breakdowns across an entire team. The Sparks took advantage of the openings they were given. They moved the ball, attacked matchups, and created the type of balanced production that makes any opponent difficult to handle. When several players are able to contribute at the same time, it becomes extremely difficult to slow down momentum.
For Indiana, this raised a bigger question about consistency. The talent is there, the potential is there, but becoming a serious contender requires more than having recognizable names. It requires a team identity that shows up even during difficult games. Every strong team eventually faces nights where the offense is not perfect. The difference is that the best teams have something reliable to fall back on. They can defend, they can slow the game down, they can create stops when everything else becomes uncomfortable. Against Los Angeles, Indiana never truly established that control, and because of that, the conversation after the game became much larger than one player's return or one individual stat line. It became about whether this team is building the habits needed to handle bigger moments. Because when the final buzzer sounded, the biggest lesson was clear. The Fever did not lose because of one missed shot, one turnover, or one player trying to return from injury. They lost because several issues appeared at the same time, and the defensive concerns might have been the loudest warning sign of all. And that is why the attention quickly shifted away from just the players on the court and toward the decisions being made from the sideline. Every coach eventually faces moments where there is no perfect answer. Every decision comes with a risk, and every choice becomes easier to judge after the result is already known. But after Indiana's loss in Los Angeles, the conversation around Stephanie White's decisions became impossible to ignore, because fans were not just questioning the final score, they were questioning the process that led there. The biggest discussion centered around how Caitlin Clark's return was handled. Managing a player coming back from an injury is always complicated. There is the responsibility of protecting the athlete, thinking about the long season, and making sure one game does not create bigger problems later. Nobody can dismiss the importance of being careful, especially when dealing with a player who means so much to the franchise's future. But the debate was never simply about whether Clark should have been limited. Most people understood that some type of restriction was expected. The bigger question became how those limited minutes were used and whether the approach gave her the best chance to actually contribute while still staying within the plan. Some fans looked at the short appearances and believed it interrupted her natural rhythm. They argued that a player known for controlling tempo and reading the game needs time to settle in. From that perspective, constantly entering and exiting made it difficult for Clark to build confidence and create the type of impact people are used to seeing. Others defended the cautious approach and pointed out that outside observers do not always know everything happening behind the scenes. Coaches and medical staffs often have information fans do not have, and decisions around player availability are usually made with factors that go beyond the scoreboard. That difference in perspective is exactly why the debate became so intense. It was not just about basketball strategy anymore. It became a conversation about trust, communication, and how Indiana plans to manage a player carrying massive expectations. Another point that generated discussion was how mistakes were handled throughout the game. Fans online debated whether different players were treated differently after difficult possessions. Some viewers felt certain mistakes led to quicker changes, while others believed the coaching staff was simply managing rotations based on the situation and available information. The reality is that every decision gets magnified when expectations rise. Before, Indiana was viewed as a team building towards something bigger. Now, every rotation, every substitution, and every late-game adjustment gets analyzed because people believe this roster has the potential to compete at a higher level. That pressure is part of what happens when a franchise enters a new chapter. More attention brings more excitement, but it also brings more criticism. Coaches are no longer judged only by wins and losses. They are judged by how they develop talent, how they create chemistry, and how they respond when difficult situations appear.
For Stephanie White, this game became one of those moments. It was not about one single decision defining everything. It was about a collection of choices that left fans asking questions after a disappointing result. Could the rotations have looked different? Could the team have found a better balance between caution and competition? Could Clark have been protected while also getting more consistent opportunities? Those questions will continue, because the expectations surrounding Indiana are different now. The Fever are not just another team trying to find their way. They have players who attract attention. They have a fan base expecting progress, and they have every decision being watched closer than ever before. And maybe the biggest takeaway is that this conversation is not only about one game against Los Angeles, it is about the future direction of the entire team. How does Indiana maximize its biggest strengths? How do they protect their stars while still chasing victories? And how do they turn potential into consistent success? Because after this loss, the biggest question is no longer just what happened against the Sparks. The bigger question is what Indiana does next. This loss could become either a warning sign or a turning point for the Indiana Fever. Every team goes through difficult moments during a long season, but the way a team responds to those moments usually reveals more than the loss itself. For Indiana, the conversation after Los Angeles was not only about fixing one bad game, it was about understanding what needs to change if this group wants to reach the level many believe they are capable of reaching. Caitlin Clark's return reminded everyone just how much attention surrounds every move this team makes. Her presence changes expectations. When she plays, people expect a different level of energy, creativity, and competitiveness. That pressure comes with being one of the most talked about players in basketball, but it also means the Fever have to find the right formula around her. The biggest challenge moving forward is balance. Indiana has to protect Clark's long-term health while also allowing her to be the player that makes her special. Those two things cannot work against each other. The goal is not simply getting her back onto the court. The goal is getting her back into situations where she can play naturally, build chemistry, and help the entire team grow. Because Clark's value has never been only about scoring points. Her biggest impact comes from the way she changes the entire game around her. The spacing she creates, the defensive attention she attracts, and the opportunities she opens for teammates are all part of what makes her important. Those things become easier when there is consistency and rhythm. But this moment is also bigger than just Clark. The Fever's future depends on the entire roster finding stability together. One superstar cannot cover every weakness. One player cannot fix every defensive mistake, every missed assignment, or every difficult stretch. Successful teams are built when every piece understands its role and contributes to the bigger picture. That means Indiana needs answers beyond individual performances. They need stronger execution when games become difficult. They need reliable production from multiple players. They need defensive consistency that does not disappear when the offense slows down. Those are the areas that separate promising teams from teams that are truly ready to compete. The positive side is that these problems are being exposed while there is still time to adjust. Difficult games often reveal the things that winning teams eventually correct. Sometimes a frustrating loss becomes the moment that forces necessary conversations and important changes. For Clark, the focus now becomes getting fully comfortable again. Returning from time away is a process. Timing, confidence, and chemistry are not always restored instantly. Even elite players need opportunities to rebuild the connection that makes everything look effortless.
For the Fever organization, the challenge is creating an environment where that process can happen successfully. Every decision matters because the expectations around this team are higher than they have ever been. Fans are no longer just hoping to see improvement. They are expecting direction, growth, and results. And that is what makes the next chapter so important. Indiana has talent. They have attention. They have players capable of creating special moments. But talent only reaches its highest level when everything around it works together. The loss to Los Angeles will eventually become just one game on the schedule, but the lessons from that game could last much longer.
The way Indiana responds could define whether this moment becomes remembered as a setback or the beginning of an important adjustment. Because the real story is not just that Caitlin Clark returned and the Fever lost. The real story is how Indiana chooses to move forward from here, and whether they can build the system needed to turn potential into something much bigger. The final score told one story, but everything surrounding this game told another. The Indiana Fever losing to the Los Angeles Sparks was frustrating, but the conversation that followed showed this was about much more than one result. It became a discussion about decisions, adjustments, expectations, and how a team handles the pressure that comes with having one of the most watched players in basketball. Caitlin Clark's return was supposed to be the headline moment, and in many ways it still was, but instead of only celebrating her being back on the court, the conversation quickly became about how that return was managed. Her performance became a debate because some people focused only on the final numbers, while others looked deeper at the situation around those numbers. And that is what makes evaluating this game so complicated. There were multiple truths happening at the same time. Clark was not at her sharpest. Indiana had areas where they needed more. The coaching staff had difficult decisions to make, and the team as a whole faced challenges that could not be explained by pointing at one person. The Fever's problems against Los Angeles were connected. The limited rhythm, the missing pieces, the defensive struggles, and the overall execution all played a role. A basketball game is never decided by one moment alone. It is built through every possession, every adjustment, and every decision made from the opening tip until the final buzzer. But sometimes these difficult moments are exactly what teams need. They reveal weaknesses that success can sometimes hide. They create conversations that force improvement, and they show whether a team is willing to make the changes necessary to reach another level. For Indiana, the spotlight is only going to become brighter. Every game will bring analysis, every decision will bring opinions, every challenge will create another discussion about where this team is heading. That is the reality of having high expectations and players capable of changing the future of a franchise. The most important question now is not about what already happened in Los Angeles. That game is finished. The real question is what the Fever learn from it. Do they find the right balance? Do they create more consistency? Do they build the type of system that allows every player to succeed when the biggest moments arrive? Because Caitlin Clark's journey with Indiana is still being written. One difficult night does not define a season. One performance does not tell the entire story. But the response after moments like this can reveal everything about where a team is truly going. The Fever have the talent, they have the attention, they have the opportunity. Now comes the part that matters most, turning all of that potential into results. And after everything that happened against the Sparks, one thing is clear. This was not just another regular season loss. It was a moment that challenged Indiana to prove what kind of team they are becoming.